Well, there were a couple of factors that motivated me to write the book. As I began the project, like many people, I think that I was enchanted by these photographs of Afghanistan in the 1950s and all of these images of development that seemed to define the place. Women studying to be nuclear physicists, people running around with not in burqas, but in miniskirts around Kabul. And there's really this sense of a world that had been lost to the war that engulfed the country following the Soviet invasion. So I wanted to try to get behind some of these myths and ask what was development really about in Afghanistan, both during that optimistic moment of the 60s, and was this really a world that had been lost, or were there factors that were actually leading towards the destruction to come? When it came to the 1980s, however, it also seemed to me that there were a lot of interesting factors that, looking at Afghanistan, would help us understand our modern world. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was not only a debacle for the Soviet Union that really led to the discrediting of Soviet-style socialism across much of the Third World, but Afghanistan was in many ways a kind of crucible where new forms of transnational political engagement, like Sunni jihadism or transnational NGO-based humanitarianism, really came into existence or reached their high point and then spread out into the world from there. So it seemed to me that by understanding Afghanistan, both during that moment of the 60s as well as during the 1980s, we could help understand not only Central Asia, but in some senses the broader world that we now live in. Well, in many cases, I was pleasantly surprised when I entered the archives to find a very different story than the one I had encountered in traditional tellings of Afghanistan. The typical narrative, I think, associated with the history of Afghanistan is what you might dub the graveyard of empires. And this is a story where sometimes it's the British, sometimes it's the Soviets, they march into the country, they have a regime change, everything goes wrong, and then they end up beaten and bloodied and leaving the country. But this is a story that oftentimes was more about, say, Moscow or London than it was about Afghanistan itself. And when I entered the archives, I found these files of not sort of imperial powers intervening per se, but people who were concerned with actual things and actual places in Afghanistan. Concerned, for example, with managing cedar forests in eastern Afghanistan, concerned with petroleum reserves in northern Afghanistan, or concerned with soil salinity in plantations in southern Afghanistan. And it struck me that by working through these natural resources and working through these people and advisors, many of whom I was able to intervene, I could reconstruct Afghanistan so that it actually seemed like a real place. It wasn't a place where these jihadist groups emerge out of nowhere to threaten the Soviets, but rather a place facing problems that are very similar to the world that we dwell in today, where there's ecological collapse in many parts of the country and people turn to extreme solutions to rectify the problems that they're facing. So it was a way to kind of build from the ground up in that sense. And to come back to the graveyard of empires narrative, it struck me that in doing this we could restore a certain kind of agency to Afghanistan in the narratives that we're telling about the place. We could tell a history of Afghanistan that was focused around places and provinces like Paktia in eastern Afghanistan with the forests, like northern Afghanistan with the oil reserves, or southern Afghanistan with the plantations and irrigation projects. To tell a story of Afghanistan that wasn't about Moscow or Washington or London, but was rather about these Afghan provinces and the country itself. Well, I think one is that we need to get beyond using the term of failed state to refer to Afghanistan. I think a better question to ask, rather than is this country a failed state or not, is what's the nature and what's the style of its engagement with outside foreign resources. Whether we like it or not, a place like Afghanistan, virtually since it entered the international state system and started engaging with outside powers, has always been mostly receiving and sometimes giving money to a broader international economy, often receiving subsidies from imperial powers of the day. In the 19th century, it might have been the British Empire, South Asia, and so on. In much of the 20th century, it took on a new form with superpowers. And today, obviously, it takes on a different form still, with Western donor states and the NGO community worldwide. So I think the better question to ask, rather than why is this place constantly failing, is why is this country that's on the other side of the planet from the United States, and in many ways very remote from these other powers, why has it been so successful, actually, in acquiring this perceived geopolitical importance and drawing in these foreign resources? So by turning the shift from failed state to sort of exchange of Western resources to Afghanistan, that's one thing that I think we can learn. More broadly, though, when it comes to the emergence of humanitarianism in the 1970s and 1980s, I think one thing we can understand by looking at Afghanistan is, of course, this was a communist state. This was an Afghanistan that had had a socialist government. And what I think is really interesting, and what I found in the archives, was that many of the NGO groups, many European NGOs who allied with the Mujahideen to attack the communist government in Afghanistan, had undergone a really radical shift in their thinking about the privileges and rights of sovereignty for third world socialist states. Many of these people had celebrated the collapse of South Vietnam and the capture of South Vietnam by North Vietnamese communists only a few years earlier in 1975. Yet by 1979 and 1980, it became a no-brainer for many of these people to collaborate with very, very right-wing Islamist militias to attack and overthrow a left-wing government in Kabul. So this is a book about Afghanistan, but it's also a book that deals with ideas too, and shifts in thinking about how Westerners, how progressive people should interact with third world socialist states. Well, there were many finds, and I really had the privilege for this book to travel to a lot of different locations, much time in Moscow, much time in Central Asia, and interviews as well. But I think that one experience which really sticks in my head, and I think really comes back to me from the motivation to write this book in the first place, was an anecdote that I found in the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Higher Education. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union sent not only oil technicians and engineers and so on, but also teachers of the Russian language to go to Kabul and go to the provinces to educate Afghans in Russian, to obviously interface with all this infrastructure. And I found a written report by a Russian lady who was a Russian language teacher in northern Afghanistan, who'd been using the example of space exploration, like cosmonauts and so on, to teach the Russian language to her students. And in her report, she noted that I went around the room asking my Afghan students if they wanted to be a cosmonaut, an astronaut, when they grew up. And she was really surprised and found that none of them said they wanted to become Afghan cosmonauts. And she was perplexed. She said, why would you not want to do this thing? The Soviet Union has sent Yuri Gagarin and these people into space. This is really the sign of what it means to be a modern state in the world. And they said, no, 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 you don't understand. We don't want to be Afghan cosmonauts. Afghanistan is this poor country. We're never going to achieve this kind of modernity. We want to be Soviet cosmonauts. And the only way I can imagine myself entering space, but in some sense entering the modern world, is with the help of the Soviet Union. Now, none of this is to excuse the later Soviet intervention and the massive violence that was visited on Afghanistan. But for me, more than illustrating, I think, this poignant personal moment as recorded by this Russian language teacher, it really speaks to the profound effect and the profound admiration that a lot of people in the third world had for the Soviet model of development. And I think that we look at crises today, such as Syria, it's very evident that there's still large circles, whether we like it or not, in places like the Middle East and Africa, of communities, of elites who still very much look to Russia as their gateway to entering international life or staying in international life.